piece, every time I revisit it, even without having practiced it as today, I wanted to say, wow, what an incredible piece, more modern, 100 years after and more, almost 110 years since it was written, than today. Is it tonal? Is it atonal? Who knows? Somewhere in between. Tonal centered, atonal centered, that's not important. Mouvement is from this 1900 book one of Images by Debussy. I think it's the predecessor of everything today we consider repetitive minimalist music. It's also the predecessor and avant-garde vision of what music would become once you take it out of its formal frame. Just the sheer energy, the industry, jubilation of the sound production of continuous flow, something like perpetual motion. In that sense, years ago, when I was young, I composed a piece for piano, which I called the dead end, or impasse in French. 2 against 3 on white keys, very fast, intertwined the two hands. And I was finding that very interesting to obtain a piece which reveals itself differently every time you play it, because the 2 against 3 intertwine differently according to the resonances. Perpetual motion, intertwining the parts of two hands, creating some kind of a forever evolving pattern in a way that is not stuck and stiff, or it's not organized. It's just as if you throw the dice, and they follow as they do. Sometimes you hear because of the left hand's thumb on the top part of the fifths. It's sort of a melodic note, but then you also hear the air legato sextuplets and combine. But then if you put the pedal, as you do, and you have to, but perhaps just a shiver of a pedal, a quarter of a pedal, just enough to wet the palate, but not to define the ingredients, to have them just blend. To the listener to define which aspect of the texture the listener privileges to follow with their ear, trained or untrained, or amateur or professional, even if somebody already played the piece. But let's say majority didn't, and sit in the whole audience and listen to a piece, and just listen to it and absorb what they can through their ears, through their psyche, of course, filtering it, and this piece doesn't leave a lot of clues. It doesn't give you like a thematic material. It doesn't give you a formal GPS of the development of the piece. It seems like it just runs on its own energy until it stops. Wait, it finishes. And I find that fantastic because Debussy. Probably, and in the time frame of his lifetime, in the context of his time period, this kind of music was probably considered ill-conceived or unfinished. It's almost as if the scaffolding is the facade itself while being built. Some kind of that impression. Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me that people feared the dissonances in his opera Péléas and Mélisande, and when the orchestra finished tuning, they applauded, thinking it was over with the dissonances, so they can listen to only consonant stuff, because consonances were still dissonant. Freudian slip. Dissonances were the consonances of the day, because sometimes the dissonances are disturbing until they become familiar, and then you have to go another further step to be more dissonant. But the point is that those seconds, or they don't sound like a dissonance that needs to be resolved into a consonance. It's not like for it's okay, it's around C, but it's not major, well, a little bit more than minor, but for sure not as a tonality. And when you have the only thematic material, which in fact is only the embryo of a theme, in fact it's a motif. And this pattern with the open fifths, without thirds, which means no major, no minor, that means neutral, is very brassy, very projecting, very broadcasting. But he doesn't do much with it. It's not like a theme he'll develop. There's no fugato, there is no anything. It's just a flow. And this spark. Beginning of the middle section, which is inevitably middle sections come, but sometimes they're lesser exciting than the A sections. They're more like the other section. But in fact, here he continues with the pattern of the flow of the 16th notes. And he introduces some kind of chordal flotation, I would say. But it's not dominant of B minor, it's just on F sharp. Harmonic changes are like mood changes, more sky changes with cloud, and then without cloud, and the sun rays, and then blocking them, and then shining. Some harmonic G sharp A flat. I don't think it's meant to be more than what it is, which is just a atmospheric. Epidermic, almost a sensorial feel rather than a harmonic projection or a sequence. I find that to be the essence of Debussy's music language, is that it's also into the senses. The wind, the sun, the rays. He can translate musically all these kind of sensations that we feel by our skin to the elements of the weather, of the nature. We feel almost like as if through our ears, our imagination, through our psyche, we are plunged into this sound bath. There's always some something so aquatic about his music, as if the drops of water or a stream flowing. And a drop. Even when he does this sequence, he doesn't sound academic, even if he could have. And you could say, okay, he just does a sequence which once, twice, 3 times reproduced. You start guessing it. But it seems like every time, and the second time, and the third time, he manages to have a different reproduction and a different, obviously, degree that brings in a surprisingly, agreeably surprising new feel. Like, oh, I didn't feel that yet in this way, or perhaps the sun ray is reaching me this way, and the wind this way, and a drop of rain this way. Of course, I stop and start and speak, and inevitably the speak is the thing I shouldn't do, because the music doesn't need me to explain it. And as a matter of fact, because I stop, then I take more time to explain things which, in real time of the piece itself, which is the music itself, the language itself, just take a few seconds. So it doesn't need me to explain that bridge, or to thematize it, or to compare it to what kind of emotional or psychological or sensorial comparison. Everybody makes their own. Of course, playing it's more about the organization of the fingers and the distribution of the 2 hands compared to the written score. But this is the kitchen work, or the cooking of the pianist work. But for the listener, it's just to hear a completely transparent flow with possibly some little thematic material pouring out. Section of the piece, in the middle of the piece, in the nucleus, in the nuclear heart of the piece, is this F-sharp ostinato in arpeggios in octaves, and then this emerging chorale of chords played by the 2 hands, like in an organ. For him, because he introduced us to these parallel chords, which are just without function, just for the coloristic sound of them, not diminished, not dominant 7ths. It's not secondary dominance, it's just dominant 7ths, but in the melodic line, and somehow diminished. But all that with the F-sharp ostinato poured all over the place after the C ostinato in the opening and the closing. So he opens with the C ostinato, and the middle section is based on the F-sharp ostinato. That I don't think is innocent choice. The tritone that holds the whole piece. That's the circle of fifths, antipodes. The tritone defines the tonal system. It basically locks it. But here, I think he's using it more like a dissonant interval that brings us to the edge of our expectations, because here we don't know what's happening, but we know something is going to happen. So we have C, fully C, And in the middle section, we have fully F sharp as a ostinato bed, and then comes in a flow, not just as I marked it. Back to the C ostinato, the opening. Now this middle section doesn't have to be consistently and continuously forte. It should emerge slowly like out of the waters. A crescendo that I artificially add to it as an interpretational choice of mine, or because I want to impose an ideology over what is, but what is repetitive. And what repetitive means éco-cell, and Debussy, I think, is the master of this sort of stuttering. That's not chord. But anyway, yes, he uses this short group of 3 or so notes, and then he repeats them, harmonizing them differently, but sometimes just melodically restating it and advancing so by little shreds. It's not like a continuous melodic line that has a vision to the long distance to be so emotional, romantic in that sense of expression. Rather something more by thrusts and by tiles, like in a Lego, tom pom pom, mi sol la fa, mi re mi do, si do la sol la fa, si do, and then the flow of the F sharps, as if the pianist has 4 hands. 2 to play these, and 2 to play these. And when you combine them, you have to be very careful to use what Debussy's music is for the piano, basically resonance, which is once you've played it, you hear the resonance of it, because, of course, the pedal holds what the chord was played, plucked. Thick and heavy, like for instance the opening of a Brahms B major trio. You feel the legato, you feel the hold, you feel the warmth, the tenuto of each note until the next. That's the romantic era, and in Debussy you feel this. Last by the resonance while you play the rest. You have to take them off so the pedal holds them. So all the dampers held up, and therefore the resonance can be. It's more like harp, really, what it is for Debussy's understanding of his texture, of his soundscape imagination. chord, the dominant pedal, but not resolution on the tonic, the parallel chords, the repetitive patterns of group of 2 or 3 notes for the motivic element, the echo cells, as I call them for Debussy, are all of his signatures already in 1900, way before he wrote his etudes for piano, which are so much more exploring even more the technique of playing piano, or how the piano can play repeated notes, fifths, octaves, and all these different devices. But here in 1900, when he writes in 1905 this book 1, or 1901 rather, of the Image, of which that's the number 3, Mouvement, I think he's exploring something that he will develop later in the piano, just the sheer jubilant mechanism of performing on it. Is as if the piano is fun to play, and the resonances you produce from that this combination of textures are fun. They're just jubilant, they're just resonant, and in a way like rays through the clouds, or without the clouds, that reach you differently, and every time it reveals itself slightly differently, because I think of that flow consistently of the 16th notes in triplets. And not only, but partly with the pedal, and the acoustics, of course, helps if the resonance is larger in an acoustical room than a room here, which is very dry acoustically. But the pedal compensates from that. But in any case, the imagination of Debussy, seemingly in 1900, was already pianistically way beyond the instrument. It's orchestral, but it's also choral in a way. It's choir and orchestra, and you hear things with long values and short values, and things intertwine, and things combine, and things collide in terms of textures. And I think that's the beauty of this piece. I find that you practice to play it right and clean and even and organized and shifted and prepared and anticipated, and you know, you just take care of business, as they say, when you play. While the result that you obtain varies from the place where you play, the instrument on which you play, and in a way it's in the ear of the beholder, obviously, ultimately, of the listener. But you cook it to present it to the audience, and sometimes, since you cook it in real time in front of them, it comes or reveals itself more or less like you expected, and sometimes not really. And of course, if you get stiff in the arm, you have to practice a lot the independence of the fingers placed from the palm and not from the wrist, in order to keep the forearm free, in terms not to have tendons tension, and then not shoulders up and not compensating, and just being able to play very long time this articulation of air legato, which I call sort of the clear articulation, like flossed fingers. Even if it's 2, 3, 4, especially 3, 4, and 4, 5, which have common tendons, so for them to be independent, well, you have to play the thumb on. When I said fun earlier, perhaps it is not the correct word, but jubilant will be that. Like you watch it happen with with astonishment, with amusement, like, wow, what an interesting combination of sounds. I assume I'll never know how one heard this piece when it was composed within the time frame of its composition, so that I'm not influenced by having heard, and can't isolate having heard way more dissonant, way more, let's say, further pushing the envelope of all these elements in more contemporary music following Debussy's lifetime. And so to play this piece today, over 100 years later, it's almost looking at it a little bit into the past. It is present while I play it, but I try to imagine how audacious that must have bothered or or enticed the hearing and the psyche of the listeners of the time of Debussy, compared to today's, where perhaps they'll find it almost, let's say, conservative. Is it modal, tonal, atonal, polytonal, who knows what tonal, as I said in the beginning, it doesn't matter in which category one places it. It's just that I feel that when you play music of that time period, Fauré and Ravel and Dukas and Roger Dukas and Roussel and all these beautiful, different from each other composers, because we call them the French composers as if they all had some kind of common thread. They didn't influence each other, probably some did. There are a little Debussy in Fauré, there is a little bit of Satie in Poulenc, and so on and so forth, but really not. I really think they're like very much of ecosystems of their own, all these few French, very living almost at the same time period composers. But they didn't try to be different. I think they just were who they were. And it happens to be that we connect to them for who they are in the history of music. But in its time frame, that must have been a very audacious endeavor. And I find that this will be something I will never perhaps really experiment. But I'm still finding it extremely modern, in the sense that it triggers a lot of questions in performing it today. It doesn't sound at all like old-fashioned stuff. That's provocative to say so. It just sounds incredibly modern to me. Probably to you too. Thank you.